The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. In the back row, a man in his 70s sat quietly, his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes glancing nervously around the room. His name was Bill Turner, a man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small town, and now, here he was, in the middle of a legal battle he never could have imagined. He had no idea how he'd ended up in this situation, but now, facing the stern gaze of Judge Mitchell, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Judge Mitchell was no stranger to controversy. Known for his sharp tongue and unwavering sense of superiority, he thrived on belittling anyone who dared to step into his courtroom. Today, that target was Bill. "Mr. Turner," Judge Mitchell called out, his voice dripping with disdain. "I have to ask, what are you doing here? You look like you belong in a retirement home, not a courtroom. Are you even capable of understanding the charges against you?" Bill shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His glasses slid down his nose, and he pushed them back up with a trembling hand. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He had spent a lifetime staying out of the spotlight, avoiding attention, keeping to himself. But now, here he was, facing accusations he couldn't even comprehend, in a place where people treated him like an outdated relic. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gaze turned icy. He was waiting for Bill's response, but Bill had no idea what to say. All he could do was look down at the papers in front of him, the words on the page a blur he could hardly make sense of. His world had always been simple, working a blue-collar job, raising his daughter, watching Clint Eastwood movies in his free time. But today, none of that seemed to matter. "Mr. Turner," Judge Mitchell continued, his voice rising, "you need to answer me. Are you even capable of defending yourself? Or should we just call it a day and send you to the retirement home, where you belong?" Bill's face flushed a deep red. He had never been good with words, especially not when he felt cornered. The words the judge had said were harsh, but they weren't entirely unfair. He was old, he was out of touch with the world, and now, here he was in a courtroom where everyone seemed to be a step ahead. But there was something about this moment that felt wrong, something that pushed Bill to his breaking point. He had always been a man of patience, of perseverance. He had dealt with loss, disappointment, and hardship, but he had never been mocked. Not like this. The prosecutor, James Richards, a slick young man who couldn't have been older than 30, smirked as he stood up from his seat. He was eager to get this over with, and Bill was his easy target. "Your Honor," Richards began, "I think we've all seen enough. The defendant clearly doesn't have the mental capacity to understand the gravity of the charges against him. It's time to wrap this up and move on." The word stung, but it wasn't the first time someone had underestimated Bill. He had heard it all before, the whispers, the jokes, the dismissive glances. He had always tried to ignore it, tried to keep moving forward. But today, it felt different. He wasn't just being ignored. He was being dismissed. As the prosecutor spoke, Bill noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with a calm intensity that made Bill pause. The figure was tall, his posture rigid, his face a study in quiet focus. Bill couldn't place it, but something about the man felt familiar. The courtroom's attention was diverted as the doors to the back opened, and a man stepped forward. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. People shuffled in their seats, some looking confused, others intrigued. The man was elderly, much like Bill, though his demeanor was anything but frail. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room as if he had seen this all before. Bill's heart skipped a beat. There was something about this man, his confidence, his presence, that caught Bill off guard. He had seen him before, but where? The stranger approached Bill's side and quietly sat down next to him, his calm gaze meeting the judge's with an unspoken understanding. The man's gray hair was neatly combed, and his sharp jawline gave him an air of authority. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Mitchell, who had been all too eager to tear Bill down, now stared at the newcomer with an unreadable expression. "And who are you?" he asked, his tone a mix of irritation and curiosity. The man smiled slightly, but there was no hint of humor in it. "I'm Clint Eastwood," he said simply. For a moment, the room was silent. No one knew how to react. Clint Eastwood. The name was legendary, but surely this wasn't the Clint Eastwood. The actor, the man who had shaped Hollywood for decades, couldn't possibly be here, sitting next to Bill Turner in this crumbling courtroom. Clint Eastwood? Judge Mitchell repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Are you here to play one of your old cowboy roles? Because if so, you're a little late for a movie audition, Mr. Eastwood." Clint, unperturbed by the judge's sarcasm, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "No, Judge," Clint said coolly. "I'm here as Bill Turner's legal counsel." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. "Legal counsel? Are you serious? You're telling me Clint Eastwood is here to defend this man?" Clint didn't flinch. "I am, Your Honor. And I plan to do a far better job than any lawyer this court has seen." Bill, still in shock, glanced at Clint, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had always admired Clint Eastwood, but this was something out of a dream. Was it possible that Clint Eastwood, the man he had watched on screen countless times, was here to help him? The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Judge Mitchell's face tightened with annoyance. "This is preposterous," he muttered, but Clint's calm demeanor seemed to dissolve any further argument. Bill felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. There was someone with power and skill, who was on his side. And in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as out of place here as he had thought. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Bill Turner had never expected his life to lead him here, to this point, in this courtroom. If you'd asked him 10 years ago where he'd be at 72, he probably would have said something simple, living in his modest home in a small town, watching reruns of the good, the bad, and the ugly on his old television, enjoying a quiet, peaceful life. But life, it seemed, had other plans for him. Bill was born in a time when things were a bit slower, simpler. His parents had raised him with strong values, hard work, humility, and the importance of family. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, a place where everyone knew everyone else, where people said hello with a smile, and life felt as steady as the rolling fields that stretched out in all directions. Bill's childhood had been nothing extraordinary, but it was good. When Bill turned 20, he married his high school sweetheart, Marie. Together, they had a daughter, Claire. He worked in a local factory, doing his best to provide for his family. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He took pride in it, and he was content. His love for Marie was unwavering, and he did everything he could to be the best husband and father. But like all things in life, change came. Marie passed away when Claire was just 16. The loss was devastating for Bill. She had been his rock, his partner, his world. And suddenly, he was alone, left to raise Claire on his own. He did the best he could, but the weight of raising a daughter by himself was heavier than he'd anticipated. Claire grew up, went off to college, and eventually started a life of her own. But the pain of losing Marie never truly went away. It was like a scar on his heart that would never heal. And though he had his daughter, Bill found himself increasingly lonely in his later years. The house that once felt so full of life was now eerily quiet, the sounds of his own footsteps echoing off the walls. But despite his grief, Bill never stopped loving Claire. He supported her dreams and ambitions, even if it meant being alone. He couldn't bring himself to get involved in the bustling world around him. He preferred the old ways, the days when life seemed more certain, when things were clearer. His solace came in the form of movies, old westerns, detective stories, the kinds of films that Clint Eastwood had made his name with. It was through those films that Bill found a sense of adventure, a feeling of strength that had been lacking in his own life. Clint Eastwood, the tough, no-nonsense character he portrayed in every role, became an icon for Bill. It wasn't just his rugged looks or his steely eyes, it was the way Clint's characters stood tall in the face of adversity, facing impossible odds with a quiet, unwavering confidence. Bill admired that strength, even though he didn't have it himself. He found himself watching Clint's movies over and over, drawn to the idea that a man could walk into any situation, no matter how hopeless, and make things right. But now, sitting in this courtroom, Bill had never felt more powerless. His age, his quiet demeanor, his lack of experience in the fast-paced world of law, all of it seemed to work against him. The judge had mocked him, the prosecutor had written him off, and the only thing Bill had going for him was the memory of a man who had never known the struggles Bill was facing. As the trial progressed, Bill's thoughts drifted back to those days with Marie. He remembered how they would watch Clint Eastwood films together, laughing at the ridiculousness of some of the action scenes but always captivated by the way Clint's characters handled adversity. She had loved those movies too, and it had become their ritual, sitting together after a long day, escaping into a world where right always triumphed over wrong, where the bad guys always got their comeuppance. But here, in this courtroom, things didn't feel as simple. The bad guys weren't wearing black hats. The judge wasn't a villain, he was just doing his job. And the prosecutor wasn't some cartoonish foe, he was an ambitious young lawyer, out to win at any cost. It was hard for Bill to wrap his mind around it all. What had happened to the world he knew? The world where people helped one another, where neighbors were friends, and where the truth was always obvious. Everything felt so complicated now, like the answers weren't as clear-cut as they used to be. As the trial wore on, Bill's anxiety grew. He could feel the weight of the accusations pressing down on him, the fear of the unknown gnawing at his insides. What was going to happen? Would he be sent to prison for something he didn't even understand? Would he lose everything? But as those thoughts swirled in his mind, something shifted. Something changed. It was when the doors of the courtroom opened, and Clint Eastwood walked in. Bill had no idea how Clint had come to be here, sitting beside him. But as the actor-turned-attorney took his place, there was a sense of calm that washed over Bill. Clint wasn't just sitting there for show, he was here to fight for him. And in that moment, Bill realized something important, he didn't have to face this fight alone. As Clint leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room with that same steely gaze that Bill had admired for years, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in a long time. Maybe this wasn't the end for him. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of this mess. For the first time in a long while, Bill allowed himself to hope. He wasn't just an old man, lost in a world that had passed him by. He was someone who had a chance to stand tall, like Clint Eastwood's characters, and fight for what was right. And for the first time in a long while, Bill smiled. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. For the first time since the trial had begun, the air no longer felt stifling with dread. It was as if the winds of change had swept through the room, and it all had to do with the mysterious man sitting next to Bill Turner, Clint Eastwood. His presence was undeniable, and despite his age, Clint commanded attention in a way that no one else in the room could. Judge Mitchell, who had been so eager to mock Bill just moments ago, now looked slightly flustered. His cold, calculated gaze turned toward Clint Eastwood, who remained unmoved, a subtle but knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Bill, still in shock, couldn't believe his luck. How had Clint even found out about his case? What was the connection? Mr. Eastwood, Judge Mitchell said, trying to regain some control over the situation. I don't know how you got yourself involved in this. I'm here to represent Mr. Turner, Clint interrupted, his voice low and confident, yet carrying an undeniable authority. I'm his lawyer. And I suggest you hold your judgments until you've seen what I can do. There was a noticeable shift in the room, and for a brief moment, the eyes of every person present were locked on Clint. The judge's face twitched, clearly unamused by Clint's sudden intrusion into his domain. Bill could practically feel the tension simmering as Clint calmly turned his attention to the prosecutor, James Richards. "You've been making assumptions, Richards," Clint said with a measured calmness. "But I suggest you slow down. We're here to get the facts, not to judge a man based on his age or appearance." James Richards, eager to prove himself, couldn't contain his irritation. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We are in the middle of a court case, not a Hollywood show. Mr. Eastwood is a public figure, he's not a licensed attorney. What is he doing here?" Clint's smile widened just slightly. "Well, Mr. Richards, let me clear something up. I may be known for my films, but my real passion lies in justice. I've been practicing law for over 30 years, under a different name, in fact. And I'm no stranger to the courtroom." The room seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, the world outside the courtroom seemed to pause. Bill could feel the weight of Clint's words, but more than that, he felt an overwhelming sense of reassurance. Clint wasn't just here for the spectacle, he was here to win. "Objection!" Richards exclaimed, his face flushed with frustration. "This man is making a mockery of our legal system. He's not qualified." Clint didn't even flinch at the objection. "You might want to double-check your facts, Mr. Richards. I'm well within my rights to represent Mr. Turner." Judge Mitchell, still trying to regain some semblance of order, raised his hand. "Enough. We'll take a short recess to sort out this issue." As the room buzzed with conversations, Bill turned to Clint, his mind racing. You're really a lawyer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint's smile softened as he looked at Bill. "Yes, Bill. I've been practicing for a long time, under a different name, just as I said. But now, I'm here to make sure you get a fair shot. We're going to fight for you." Bill's heart swelled with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He had spent years idolizing Clint Eastwood from the comfort of his living room, and now the man was sitting beside him, offering him hope where there had once been none. For a moment, Bill thought he might pinch himself, but the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, was about to take on a fight in this very courtroom, a fight to defend Bill Turner, a man who had never asked for any of this. During the recess, Clint and Bill exchanged quiet words. Clint had insisted they keep things low-key for now, but Bill's mind was racing with 1,000 questions. How had Clint known about the case? Why had he come all this way? What did this man, the one who had inspired Bill for so many years, see in him? As they sat together, Bill couldn't help but look at Clint with a sense of awe. The man exuded quiet strength, the same strength he had always admired on screen. Clint's eyes, sharp and calculating, never left Bill as he spoke. "I know you've been through a lot, Bill. This isn't going to be easy, but we'll get through it." Bill nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his mind. Could a man like Clint Eastwood really win a case like this? Could someone with so much history, so much fame, really do more than just play a role? Clint wasn't a young man anymore. What if the world had moved on without him, leaving him behind in a world of legal jargon and complex trials? Just as Bill was about to voice his concerns, Clint placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry. I've seen much worse than this. We're going to turn things around. You've got me in your corner now." Bill didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, he felt like someone believed in him. Like he wasn't just the old man who had lived in a quiet corner of the world, but someone who deserved a chance. And that was more than he could have ever hoped for. The recess ended, and the courtroom slowly filled once again. Judge Mitchell returned to his seat, his face betraying a hint of annoyance but also curiosity. He didn't like to be made a fool of, but there was something about Clint's calm presence that seemed to force a level of respect from everyone in the room. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Mitchell said, his voice still firm but slightly less hostile. "You've made your point. But we will proceed according to the law, not Hollywood. Clint nodded. Of course, Your Honor. But I'm here to ensure that justice is served, not theater. The prosecutor, still bristling with frustration, was ready to pounce. Let's see if Mr. Eastwood's courtroom theatrics can change the facts of the case. Clint leaned forward, his eyes locking with Richards. I'm not interested in theatrics, Mr. Richards. I'm interested in truth. And I think we're about to uncover a lot of it. Bill felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Clint wasn't just here to fight, he was here to expose the truth, no matter what. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Bill believed that things could change. As the trial resumed, the rising conflict reached a new level. With Clint Eastwood in the game, the stakes had been raised. This wasn't just about Bill's case anymore. It was about proving that, no matter how old or forgotten someone might feel, they could still have a fighting chance. The courtroom was tense as Clint Eastwood stood up, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an unspoken confidence. Bill Turner sat beside him, still struggling to fully comprehend what was happening. For years, he had been alone, navigating a world that felt like it had passed him by. Now, suddenly, Clint Eastwood was sitting next to him, a man he had admired his entire life, not just as an actor, but as someone who was about to defend him in a court of law. The trial was about to take a turn. Bill could feel it in the air. The stakes had shifted. No longer were they dealing with a simple case of an elderly man caught up in a legal mess. They were up against the system itself, an unyielding bureaucracy that had no room for sentiment, only facts and judgments. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just about facts. He was about uncovering the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. And in this courtroom, the truth was the most powerful weapon they could wield. As the judge called the session back to order, Clint stood and approached the podium with a steady, almost predatory grace. Bill's heart beat faster as he watched Clint take command of the room. There was something electric about him, an aura of authority that Bill couldn't quite put his finger on. But one thing was clear, Clint was ready for war. Your Honor, Clint began, his deep voice resonating in the stillness of the room, I'd like to request that we look beyond the surface of this case. This isn't just a simple accusation against an old man, it's a misunderstanding, a setup if you will. And it's time we peeled back the layers. The judge, who had been rather dismissive of Clint's presence earlier, now narrowed his eyes in skepticism but said nothing. The prosecutor, James Richards, shot Clint a contemptuous look. He was still reeling from the fact that Clint was in the courtroom at all. Mr. Eastwood, this is not a movie set, Richards sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. We don't have the luxury of dramatic speeches here. Clint didn't flinch. He simply fixed his gaze on Richards, who seemed to shrink under the weight of that stare. It's not a movie, Mr. Richards. It's real life, and the truth is more important than any script. Bill, though still somewhat overwhelmed by the situation, couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for Clint. The man was relentless, undeterred by the pushback. Bill had always respected Clint's on-screen toughness, but seeing him handle this real-life battle with the same tenacity was something else entirely. Clint turned his attention back to the judge, his voice lowering just enough to be heard clearly across the room. I request that you allow me to cross-examine the witnesses. I intend to show that the evidence has been misinterpreted and that Mr. Turner's involvement in this matter is entirely circumstantial. The judge, still wary of Clint's unconventional methods, raised an eyebrow but nodded. Very well. You may proceed with your cross-examination. The tension in the room escalated as Clint moved to the witness stand, where the first witness, a local police officer who had been called to the scene, was waiting. The officer had testified earlier that Bill Turner had been at the scene of the alleged crime, seemingly caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clint's eyes narrowed as he observed the officer, who looked far too eager to give his version of events. Clint wasted no time. Officer Sanders, Clint began, his voice smooth and measured, you've stated that Mr. Turner was at the scene of the crime. But did you ever stop to consider that perhaps he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The officer hesitated, clearly thrown off by the question. Well, no, Did you see him commit the crime? Clint pressed, his eyes unwavering. The officer shifted uncomfortably. No, sir. But nothing, Clint interrupted. You're assuming Mr. Turner's guilt based on circumstantial evidence, without any concrete proof linking him to the crime. Isn't that right? The officer hesitated again, his confidence faltering under Clint's sharp questioning. I suppose. Clint's smile was barely perceptible, but it sent a ripple of unease through the courtroom. You suppose. But your suppositions are not enough to convict an innocent man. We need hard evidence, not assumptions. There was a long silence as Clint let the officer squirm under the weight of his words. Bill, watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was not the Clint Eastwood he had seen on the big screen, delivering one-liners and walking away from explosions in slow motion. This was a man who had lived a life of challenges and had learned how to navigate the complexities of the world. And now, he was using that experience to fight for Bill's freedom. Clint turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I request that this witness be dismissed, as his testimony is not only unreliable but irrelevant to the case at hand. Judge Mitchell hesitated, clearly taken aback by Clint's boldness. After a moment, he nodded. The witness is dismissed. We will take a short break before continuing. As the court recessed, Bill felt his anxiety ease for the first time in days. Clint had taken control of the situation with an ease and confidence that Bill could never have imagined. He wasn't just defending Bill in the courtroom, he was reshaping the entire case, pulling apart the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. Bill turned to Clint as they sat in the quiet of the recess. I don't understand. How did you know all of that? How did you know what to say to him? Clint gave him a slight, reassuring smile. I've been in enough tight spots, Bill. The key to winning any fight, whether it's in a courtroom or on a dusty street, is to never stop asking questions. Dig deep enough, and the truth always comes out. Bill nodded slowly, still processing the rapid turn of events. For the first time, he felt like someone was truly fighting for him, not just out of a sense of duty, but because they believed in him. Clint leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together as he studied Bill carefully. We're just getting started, Bill. We've got a long way to go, but we're on the right path. Stick with me, and we'll see this through to the end. Bill's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. He had spent so many years alone, unsure of where his life was heading. But now, with Clint Eastwood by his side, he felt like he had a fighting chance. And that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, the atmosphere was noticeably different. What had once been a place of intense tension now felt charged with anticipation. The prosecutor, James Richards, sat with his arms crossed, eyes narrowed in concentration. He hadn't been prepared for Clint Eastwood's quick wit and sharp legal skills, and that unnerved him. Clint's performance on the witness stand had shattered the prosecutor's narrative, and the whole courtroom had felt the shift. Clint, however, remained unfazed. If anything, his calm demeanor only seemed to intensify the scrutiny of those around him. Bill, sitting next to Clint, tried to steady his nerves, but the weight of the trial still pressed heavily on him. Despite Clint's unshakable confidence, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that things could turn south at any moment. Order in the court. Judge Mitchell's voice rang out, snapping everyone back to attention. He glanced briefly at Clint before turning to the prosecution. Mr. Richards, you may call your next witness. Richards stood, his face tight with frustration but masking a growing unease. He had not expected to feel cornered, especially not by someone like Clint Eastwood. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I called Detective Angela Harris to the stand. The courtroom doors creaked open as a tall woman in a sharp, navy blue suit entered. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator, approached the stand with the poise of someone accustomed to the spotlight. She gave Clint a quick but dismissive glance as she took her seat, her expression unreadable. Clint's eyes followed her with careful precision as she swore to tell the truth. The tension was palpable. This witness, more than the officer from earlier, was crucial to the prosecution's case. Detective Harris had been the one to gather most of the evidence against Bill Turner, and if Clint was going to dismantle this case, she would be the next target. Richards, eager to take back control of the narrative, was the first to speak. Detective Harris, could you please explain the nature of the evidence you've gathered in this case? Harris nodded confidently. Of course. We obtained security footage from a nearby store showing Mr. Turner entering the premises shortly before the incident occurred. Based on witness statements and forensic analysis, we have reason to believe that he was involved in the crime. Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained stoic. He then stood, addressing the courtroom with deliberate calmness. Detective Harris, Clint said, his voice echoing throughout the silent room. You're suggesting that Mr. Turner's mere presence at the scene is enough to implicate him in this crime. Is that right? Yes, she replied firmly. The timeline of his arrival at the scene, combined with the evidence, makes it highly likely that he was involved. Clint cocked his head, clearly interested. But you've never actually seen Mr. Turner commit any crime, have you? Harris hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the directness of Clint's question. Well, no. But no one actually witnessed him committing the crime, correct? Clint continued, pressing further. No, Harris admitted reluctantly. But Clint turned toward the judge and then addressed the court directly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the crux of the prosecution's case is circumstantial. We have no hard evidence connecting Mr. Turner to any criminal activity other than the fact that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, they would have you believe that this man, an innocent man, has been caught in some grand conspiracy. A ripple of whispers passed through the courtroom as the jury members shifted in their seats. Clint had once again taken control of the narrative, skillfully turning the case back in Bill's favor. The prosecutor was visibly flustered, but Clint wasn't finished. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, drawing in every listener. The truth is, Mr. Turner has been framed. The prosecution's case is nothing but a house of cards built on assumptions and convenient coincidences. I'm here to tell you that we don't need to look at the past, we need to look at the truth. Bill, sitting in the defendant's seat, felt a strange sense of peace settle over him as Clint spoke. The fear and anxiety that had plagued him for days were being replaced by a quiet hope. Maybe Clint was right. Maybe he had been wrongfully accused all along, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. But as Clint's words filled the courtroom, Richards shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. Mr. Eastwood is making baseless claims without any evidence. Judge Mitchell held up a hand, signaling for quiet. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, please stick to the facts. Clint didn't flinch at the interruption. Instead, he nodded, his face unreadable. Of course, Your Honor. But I'll leave the speculation to the prosecution, who seems so eager to convict based on assumptions. I prefer to stick to the facts. He turned back to Detective Harris, his eyes glinting with a mix of intelligence and defiance. Detective Harris, can you honestly say you followed every lead in this case? That you've exhausted every possibility before settling on Mr. Turner as your prime suspect? Harris shifted in her seat, uncomfortable under Clint's intense scrutiny. Well, no. We haven't. Clint cut her off. Then how can we be sure that Mr. Turner is guilty if you haven't explored every avenue of investigation? A murmur swept through the courtroom. Clint had once again called into question the integrity of the prosecution's investigation. Every word Clint spoke, every question he asked, seemed to chip away at the case they had built so carefully. With each turn, he was showing that there were more questions than answers in this case, and Bill Turner's guilt was far from certain. The judge, who had been visibly irritated with Clint's interruptions, cleared his throat. "Enough. We will take a recess. You may all return in 15 minutes. As the room began to empty, Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression relaxed. Bill turned to him, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Clint. I don't know how you do it. I don't know what you see, but you're turning everything upside down." Clint smiled, but it wasn't the smirk of a movie star. It was the smile of a man who had seen the world for what it was and had learned how to play the game of life. "Bill," Clint said, his voice calm and reassuring, "the truth doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be found." Bill sat back, processing Clint's words. For the first time, he wasn't just hoping for a miracle, he was starting to believe in the possibility of one. The recess was short, but for Bill, it felt like an eternity. He sat in the defendant's chair, unable to fully process everything that had just unfolded in the courtroom. Clint Eastwood had turned the case on its head, exposing weaknesses in the prosecution's evidence and leaving the jury to question everything they had previously believed. But Bill knew there was still more to come. The journey wasn't over yet, and the courtroom drama was far from finished. As Bill stared blankly at the table in front of him, Clint sat across from him, his demeanor calm, almost detached, as though he had seen this all before. Clint had the quiet confidence of a man who had faced much bigger challenges in his life, yet there was a weight to the case that Bill could sense. Even Clint couldn't fully predict how things would unfold from here. Bill finally broke the silence. "Clint, do you think this is it? Do you think we've turned the tide?" Clint's gaze lifted from the papers in front of him, and for the first time, Bill saw a slight crack in his usual, unflappable exterior. There was a flicker of uncertainty in Clint's eyes, but only for a moment before it vanished. He exhaled slowly and leaned forward, meeting Bill's eyes. "Bill," Clint began, his voice low but deliberate, "this trial isn't about just winning. It's about showing the world the truth. Sometimes, you can't control everything that happens in a courtroom, but you can make sure the truth stands strong. And that's what we're doing here. We're fighting for that truth." Bill nodded slowly, absorbing Clint's words. He still wasn't entirely sure how the rest of the trial would play out, but Clint's presence made him feel like there was a chance, a real chance, that things could work out. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and everyone stood as the judge re-entered. Judge Mitchell's stern expression didn't reveal much, but there was a certain tension in the air as he took his seat. "Let's proceed," he declared. "Mr. Eastwood, you may continue." Clint stood, his posture as composed as ever, and addressed the court once more. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, nodding respectfully. As he moved toward the front of the courtroom, the jury watched him intently. Clint's reputation for being a tough, no-nonsense actor was well known, but what they were seeing now was something entirely different, a master of persuasion, a legal genius who had an almost uncanny ability to dismantle an argument with a few well-chosen words. Clint's next move was to call the defense's own expert witness, an independent forensic scientist, Dr. Caroline Price. She had spent days reviewing the evidence and had already hinted at irregularities in the prosecution's case, particularly the supposed fingerprints found at the crime scene. She had been carefully chosen to cast doubt on the forensic evidence that the prosecution had presented as solid proof of Bill's involvement in the crime. Dr. Price, a woman in her late 40s with short, auburn hair, walked confidently to the witness stand. She adjusted her glasses and nodded as she swore to tell the truth. Clint took a moment to let her settle before he began. "Dr. Price," he started, his voice calm but purposeful, "you've been reviewing the forensic evidence from the crime scene, correct?" "Yes," Dr. Price replied, her voice measured. "I've examined the fingerprint analysis, as well as the other physical evidence that was presented during the investigation." Clint nodded, his eyes scanning her face. "And based on your expert analysis, do you believe the prosecution's fingerprint evidence conclusively ties Mr. Turner to the crime? Dr. Price hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice clear but careful. No, Mr. Eastwood. In fact, the fingerprint analysis is inconclusive. The prints in question could have been left at any point, and there's no solid evidence to suggest they were connected to the crime. It's entirely possible they were planted or that they're part of an unrelated incident. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Dr. Price's words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Bill felt his heart skip a beat. He had been worried about the fingerprints, the one piece of physical evidence that had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. But now, with Dr. Price's expert testimony, the prosecution's case had begun to unravel. Clint smiled slightly, but his eyes remained focused on Dr. Price. Thank you, Dr. Price. Now, can you tell the court what, in your professional opinion, would be the most likely cause of these prints being found at the scene of the crime if they were not left by Mr. Turner? Dr. Price paused, then answered, given the lack of any other substantial evidence linking Mr. Turner to the crime, I would suggest that the prints may have been left as part of a staged scenario. There's a possibility that someone deliberately placed them to frame Mr. Turner. The courtroom gasped collectively. Even the judge appeared taken aback, though he quickly regained his composure. Bill could hardly believe what he was hearing. The fingerprints, which had once seemed like the linchpin of the prosecution's case, were now in doubt. Clint turned slowly toward the jury, making sure to meet their eyes, one by one. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the evidence. The fingerprints, the witness statements, all of it is circumstantial at best. There is no solid proof that Bill Turner committed any crime. And in a case like this, where the evidence is shaky, the only thing that can hold up is the truth. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before he continued, the truth is that Mr. Turner is innocent. The truth is that he's been wrongfully accused, and now it's time to stop pretending otherwise. Clint's voice carried with unwavering conviction, and the jury could feel the weight of his words. There was no grandiose speech, no theatrics, just a simple, clear message that left little room for doubt. Bill sat in awe, his breath coming in shallow bursts. For the first time in the trial, he felt a deep sense of relief. There was still work to be done, but Clint had just delivered a powerful blow to the prosecution's case. Bill couldn't help but wonder if the tide had finally turned in their favor. As the court took another brief break, Bill leaned over to Clint, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint, I don't know how to thank you. You've changed everything. I didn't even know this was possible. Clint smiled slightly, the same quiet smile that had always held a depth of experience beyond his years. You don't have to thank me, Bill. We're not done yet. There's more to come. But we're getting there. The following morning brought with it an unsettling sense of unease. The courtroom was as tense as it had ever been. The once confident prosecutor, James Richards, now stood in front of the judge with a furrowed brow, carefully reviewing his notes. The impact of Clint Eastwood's defense strategy had been nothing short of profound. The testimony from Dr. Caroline Price had cast doubt on the very foundation of the prosecution's case, especially regarding the fingerprints that had once seemed like irrefutable evidence. Now, all that remained was the final showdown. As Clint stood up, his movements were deliberate, his demeanor as cool and composed as ever. He had spent the night meticulously going over his strategy, his mind working tirelessly to figure out the best possible way to hammer home the defense's victory. With the jury hanging on every word, Clint knew this final phase was critical. Bill's future depended on how this moment played out. Clint approached the podium, his calm confidence filling the courtroom. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, each of them hanging on to his every word, waiting to hear what he would say next. Your Honor, Clint began, his voice steady, I will not take up too much of the court's time, but I must make one thing clear. The case presented against Mr. Turner is based on circumstantial evidence and flawed assumptions. In the absence of any solid proof linking him to the crime, there is simply no reason to believe that he is guilty. He paused for a moment, glancing briefly at the jury. The fingerprint evidence, the supposed eyewitness accounts, none of it can definitively prove that Mr. Turner was at the scene of the crime with the intent to commit the offense. The prosecution has failed to establish the basic tenets of criminal responsibility. And that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is why we are here today. Clint's words rang out, his gaze unwavering as he turned to address the jury directly. We are all aware that justice is not about assumptions, or half-baked theories. It is about facts. Facts that stand up under scrutiny. And in this case, the facts do not support the claim that Mr. Turner is guilty. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Bill sat there, still trying to fully comprehend the journey that had brought him here. Just yesterday, he had feared for his future, certain that the truth was beyond his reach. But now, as Clint spoke with such clarity and power, Bill could feel a shift deep within him. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe this was where it all changed. Judge Mitchell, who had been quiet throughout Clint's statement, finally spoke. Mr. Eastwood, your argument is noted. We will now proceed to closing statements from the prosecution. Richards rose to his feet with an air of irritation, his posture rigid. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered so effortlessly, and it was clear that the case was slipping away from him. He had lost the confidence of the jury, and now it was time to mount one last attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, members of the jury, Richards began, his voice carrying a note of frustration, we have presented the evidence, and we have shown you that Bill Turner was present at the scene of the crime. The forensic evidence, the fingerprints, the witness accounts, these are the facts. These are the pieces of the puzzle that we've put together to show that Bill Turner is guilty of this crime. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Clint. You heard the defense's claims. You've heard their theories. But the truth is, they are nothing more than distractions. The evidence is clear. Mr. Turner had the opportunity to commit this crime, and we have the proof. Clint's face remained unreadable as he stood to face Richards, the intensity of their gaze like two opposing forces about to collide. The tension between them was palpable, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Richards tried once more to drive home his point. The prosecution has provided you with facts, ladies and gentlemen. And those facts point to one undeniable conclusion: Bill Turner is guilty of murder. For a moment, it seemed as if the air had thickened, and the whole room held its collective breath. Bill's heart raced, his palms sweaty as he waited for the judge to make his ruling. But Clint was ready. His calm demeanor never wavered, and the gravity of his presence in that moment seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Judge Mitchell gave a short nod. Thank you, Mr. Richards. The jury will now deliberate. With that, the jury was escorted out of the courtroom, leaving behind an air of uncertainty. Clint remained standing, his eyes locked on the doors as the jury exited. He seemed unbothered by the uncertainty. After all, in his line of work, the outcome of any case was never certain until the very end. But Clint was a man who had learned to accept that. He knew there was no such thing as a perfect victory, only a fight that was worth taking on. Bill looked up at Clint, who stood beside him, unflinching in the face of the looming verdict. He had been through so much over the past few days, but now, with Clint's defense, Bill felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Clint, Bill said, his voice low but sincere, thank you. I don't know what would have happened without you. You've given me a chance, a real chance. Clint placed a hand on Bill's shoulder, offering a brief, reassuring squeeze. This isn't over yet, Bill. But you're right. We've given ourselves the best shot we've got. A few moments later, the jury returned. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel. As they filed back into the courtroom, Bill's heart pounded in his chest. He had done everything he could to prepare for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare him for what was to come. Members of the jury, Judge Mitchell called out, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood and addressed the judge. Yes, Your Honor. We have. The entire room seemed to exhale in unison as the verdict was read aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Bill Turner, not guilty. The words hung in the air, and Bill's mind went blank for a moment. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not guilty. He wasn't guilty. He was free. After everything, after all the pain and fear, he was free. Clint turned to Bill, his usual stoic expression softening just enough to reveal a trace of satisfaction. "Congratulations, Bill," he said quietly. "You've got your life back." Bill's eyes welled with tears as he shook Clint's hand. "I can't thank you enough. You saved me." Clint smiled, the light in his eyes suggesting a deeper, more profound understanding. Sometimes, all it takes is a little faith in the truth. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of murmurs and whispers, but Bill didn't hear any of it. All he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of relief flooding through him. He was free, and it was thanks to Clint Eastwood, the man who had stood by him when the world seemed to be falling apart. The courtroom had emptied out, but Bill Turner remained seated in his chair, his mind racing, still trying to comprehend the weight of the moment. Not guilty. It was a verdict he had feared would never come, and yet, against all odds, it had arrived. Clint Eastwood had done what no one else had been able to, he had saved him. Bill was free, his name cleared, and his future uncertain, but full of possibility. Clint remained at his side, offering a silent strength that Bill had come to depend on. The two of them sat together in the empty courtroom, the sounds of footsteps and voices from the hallway distant and muffled. "You did it, Clint," Bill said softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually did it. I don't know how to thank you." Clint glanced at Bill, his expression neutral, but his eyes reflected a knowing calm. "You don't have to thank me. We did it together." Bill looked over at Clint, taking in the older man's steady, unwavering presence. There was something almost mystic about Clint's ability to keep his cool in the face of adversity. Bill had seen it before in the movies, but witnessing it in real life, especially in such a high-stakes, personal situation, was a different experience altogether. Clint's voice broke through Bill's thoughts. "It's not over, Bill. Your case might be over, but the world doesn't just stop because of a verdict." Bill nodded, understanding the gravity of Clint's words. He had been given a second chance, but what would he do with it? The life he had known before the trial, the life of quiet routine, was gone. His freedom felt like a breath of fresh air, but it was also the beginning of a new challenge, a challenge to rebuild, to start again. "Yeah," Bill said, leaning back in his chair. "I guess I've got a lot to figure out now. It's not like I've got a plan for what happens next." Clint offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No one does. Life's like that, sometimes, it's about stepping into the unknown and figuring it out along the way." Bill chuckled, rubbing his forehead. "I never thought I'd be here, to be honest. I thought my life was pretty much over after everything that happened." Clint's voice became more reflective. "Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. You've got a second chance now. Don't waste it." Bill nodded slowly. "I won't. I don't know what comes next, but I'll make it count. For my family, for myself." As the two men stood up, Bill couldn't help but feel a sense of weightlessness. The shackles of the trial had been removed, but there was still a long road ahead, a road he wasn't sure he was ready to walk alone. Clint placed a hand on Bill's shoulder again, this time firmer, more like a mentor offering guidance. "You've got it in you, Bill. Don't forget that." As they left the courtroom together, the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon outside. The golden hues of the evening sky seemed to reflect Bill's newfound freedom. The weight of his criminal charges had been lifted, but the uncertainty of life still loomed ahead. Bill had always been the kind of man to take life one day at a time, but now, with his life in the balance, he felt a newfound clarity. He didn't know where he was headed next, but he knew it would be different. He could feel it deep within himself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, just like Clint had taught him. With determination and an unshakable belief in himself. As they stepped out into the fresh air, Clint turned to him. "I'm headed back to California soon," Clint said, his voice casual but carrying an air of finality. Bill looked at him in surprise. "So, what now? Are you just leaving?" Clint gave him a thoughtful look. "I've done what I needed to do. My part in your story is finished for now, but that doesn't mean yours is over. You've got a fresh start ahead of you, Bill. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Bill stood there, watching Clint's figure begin to fade as he walked toward the parking lot. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also a lingering sense of fear. He had been given a second chance at life, but how would he use it? The possibilities were endless, but so were the obstacles. As Clint's silhouette disappeared from view, Bill felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a message from his daughter, Emily. "Dad, I can't believe it. I knew you'd pull through. I'm so proud of you. I'll be waiting for you when you get home." Bill's chest tightened as he read her words. He had almost lost her. He had almost lost everything. But now, he was about to walk into a future where he could hold on to what mattered most. A surge of emotion rushed through Bill, but he forced himself to push the tears back. He had a second chance to be the father he wanted to be, the man he had always hoped to become. It was all in his hands now. It had been a few weeks since the trial, and Bill Turner had finally begun to piece his life back together. The chaos and fear of the courtroom drama had faded, replaced with a growing sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. His name was cleared, his future uncertain but filled with possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, Bill could breathe again. However, despite the victory, a part of him felt unsettled. Clint Eastwood's departure had left a void, a mentor, a guiding hand, someone who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Bill had spent hours thinking about Clint's words. "What you do with this second chance is entirely up to you." But what did that mean? What was Bill supposed to do now that his past was behind him, and the future stretched before him like an open road with no clear direction? As Bill sat in his modest apartment, the TV in the background offering noise that didn't quite reach his thoughts, he stared at a framed photo on his desk, a picture of his daughter, Emily, taken on her high school graduation day. Her smile was bright, full of promise, and the look in her eyes reflected hope. She had been his reason for fighting, his reason for not giving up during the dark days of the trial. But now that the trial was over, what kind of father could he be? Could he still provide her the stability and guidance she needed? Or had he failed her by putting her through the public humiliation and distress of a courtroom drama? The truth was, he had been a good father once. Before the accusations, before everything had gone wrong, he had always done his best. But now, Bill was unsure of who he was anymore. The events of the past few months had shattered his sense of self. He had been someone else in the eyes of the public, someone accused, judged, and condemned. How could he move forward? Bill's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He got up slowly, still lost in his mind, and opened it to find a familiar face, his old friend, Mike Dawson. Mike had been one of the few people who had stuck by Bill throughout the trial, even when others had turned their backs on him. Mike had offered support, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around them. "Hey, man," Mike said with a broad grin. "I brought lunch. I figured we could catch up. I know you've been laying low." Bill stepped aside, letting Mike into the apartment. The scent of sandwiches and coffee filled the air, a comforting reminder of simpler times. "Thanks, Mike. You didn't have to do this." Bill motioned for Mike to sit at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the conversation he knew was about to unfold. "I did," Mike insisted, sitting down with a friendly thud. "You've been through a lot, Bill. It's good to see you starting to get back on your feet." How are you holding up? Bill sighed and slumped into the chair opposite him. Honestly? I'm not sure. I thought I'd be relieved when the trial was over, when the verdict came in. But now, it just feels like there's this big hole in my life. Mike raised an eyebrow. A hole? What do you mean? Bill hesitated, unsure how to put his feelings into words. I've been given this second chance, right? But now that the storm is over, I don't know what to do with it. I'm not sure who I am anymore. Mike studied him for a moment, then chuckled lightly. You've been through hell, Bill. Anyone would feel lost after everything you've been through. But this is just the beginning. You've got a fresh start, and that's a hell of a lot more than most people get. Bill looked down at his hands, the weight of Mike's words settling on him. It's not that easy. I don't even know where to begin. How do I go back to being the man I was? The man I wanted to be for Emily? Mike reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Bill's arm. You don't have to go back to anything, Bill. You're not the same person you were before all this. You've been through something no one should ever have to experience. But you're still you. And you're still the man Emily looks up to. I know that's not easy to see right now, but that's the truth. Bill lifted his head, looking at Mike with a mix of gratitude and doubt. I want to believe that. I really do. But how do I make up for all the time I lost? For all the damage I've done? How do I fix that? Mike smiled softly, leaning back in his chair. You don't fix it all at once. It's not going to happen overnight. But you start small. You show up for your daughter. You take things one step at a time. And you don't give up, no matter how hard it gets. Bill nodded, taking a deep breath. It was the first time in a while that someone had given him something simple to hold on to. A small step forward. The truth was, he had been overwhelmed by the idea of fixing everything at once. But maybe Mike was right. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything in one go, it was about showing up, about doing what he could, one day at a time. After a long pause, Mike stood up and grabbed his bag. I'm going to let you think about that for a while, okay? You've got a lot to figure out, but you're not alone. I'm still here. Bill looked at his friend and smiled, a genuine smile that felt foreign but welcome. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. As Mike left the apartment, Bill stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. The emptiness still lingered, but it was no longer suffocating. He didn't have to have everything figured out right away. He just had to take it one step at a time. Later that evening, Bill sat on his couch, staring at the phone in his hands. He had sent Emily a simple message earlier, telling her he would be home soon, and that he had something important to discuss with her. The phone buzzed with a reply. I'm excited, Dad. I can't wait to see you. We'll figure everything out together. Bill felt a wave of warmth wash over him. She was right. They would figure it out together. This wasn't the end of his story, it was just a new beginning. He wasn't the man he had been before the trial, and he wasn't sure who he would become. But one thing was certain, he had a second chance to make things right. And he would. One step at a time. The weeks that followed Bill Turner's second chance were filled with small but meaningful steps. His life hadn't suddenly transformed into a fairy tale, it wasn't that simple. There was still a weight of uncertainty hanging over him, and the shadows of the past had not completely vanished. But there was a subtle shift in the way he approached each day. The future, once a looming abyss, now seemed like a road he could cautiously begin to walk. Bill knew that the first step in his journey back to his old self, or perhaps, to a new self, was reconnecting with his daughter, Emily. They had spoken over the phone during the trial, but it wasn't the same as being together in person. The distance between them had always been more than just physical, it was emotional, something the trial had strained further. One evening, Bill received a text from Emily, Dad, I know you've been busy, but I really miss you. Can we meet up this weekend? Bill stared at the message for a long time, a smile creeping onto his face. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed her until that moment. She had been his anchor during the darkest days, the reason he had fought to clear his name. Now, with the trial behind him, he could finally focus on being there for her in the way he had always intended. He quickly typed back, "I miss you too, Em. Let's make it happen. I'll pick you up on Saturday." Saturday arrived with the kind of anticipation Bill hadn't felt in years. He cleaned up his apartment, spent some time organizing his thoughts, and got ready to see Emily. It felt like a fresh start for both of them, a chance to rebuild the relationship that had been tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. When Bill arrived at Emily's apartment, she was waiting outside with a smile that seemed to brighten the whole street. She was taller now, her features more mature, but that same spark of optimism was still there. It reminded Bill of the daughter he had always been so proud of, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was stepping into the role of the father he had always wanted to be. "Hey, Dad," Emily said, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I'm so glad we're doing this." Bill hugged her back, feeling the knot in his chest loosen. "Me too, Em. I'm so sorry for everything that happened. I want to make it right." Emily pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a soft smile. "You don't need to apologize, Dad. I know you did what you had to do. And I know you did it for me. I'm just happy to have you back." Bill's heart swelled with gratitude, but also a deep sense of guilt. "I've missed so much, Em. I've been so caught up in everything that I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I want to make it up to you." They spent the afternoon together, catching up over coffee, strolling through the park, and simply talking, like they used to. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Bill could see the walls Emily had put up after everything that had happened, but he also saw something else, the same love and trust she had always had for him. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fill him with hope. As they sat on a bench by the lake, watching the sun begin to set, Emily turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, what happens now? What's next for you?" Bill paused, looking at his daughter. He had been asking himself that question for weeks. There was no clear answer, no roadmap for the future. But there was something he had come to realize during these quiet moments with her. The future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be built, one decision at a time. "I'm not sure what's next, Em," Bill said honestly, his voice steady. "But I do know one thing, I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to be the father you deserve, and I'm going to rebuild the life I should have had from the start." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I believe you, Dad. I really do." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the lake, Bill felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was a peace he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to take it on, step by step. That night, after dropping Emily off at her apartment, Bill drove home with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight that had been hanging over him for so long was lighter now, and though there were still obstacles ahead, he was no longer afraid of them. The future might be unknown, but it wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. As Bill entered his apartment, he sat down at his desk and picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and found Clint's number. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he hit send. "Clint, I don't know if you'll get this message, but I wanted to thank you again. You helped me get my life back on track. I'm still figuring things out, but I wanted you to know that what you did for me, it meant everything. I'm taking it one day at a time, but I'm finally moving forward. Thanks for being there." Bill set the phone down, the words hanging in the air. He didn't need a reply from Clint, the message was for him, a reminder of how far he had come and how much he still had left to do. With that, Bill turned off the lights and lay down in bed. His mind raced with possibilities, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't full of fear or doubt. They were full of hope. Tomorrow would be a new day. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Bill Turner had made a promise to himself: he would start fresh, rebuild his life, and, most importantly, continue to be a father Emily could count on. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Bill was about to face a few more unexpected ones that would push him further out of his comfort zone. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Bill received an unexpected phone call. He was sitting at his kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee as he sifted through some old legal papers. His mind was still processing the whirlwind of the past few months, but he had come to accept that, at least for now, things were quiet, too quiet. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen. Clint Eastwood. Bill's heart skipped a beat. It had been weeks since he'd sent the message. He wasn't expecting Clint to respond, let alone call him. Taking a deep breath, Bill answered. "Hello." "Bill," Clint's gravelly voice echoed through the phone. "I got your message. It sounds like you're doing well." Bill leaned back in his chair, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. "Yeah, I'm getting there. I've been keeping busy, spending time with Emily. It's been a lot to process, but I'm figuring it out." There was a pause on the other end, and Bill could almost hear Clint thinking. "That's good. I'm glad you're taking steps forward. But listen, I called because I need a favor." Bill straightened up, surprised by the sudden shift. "A favor? What kind of favor?" Clint's voice became serious. "I've got a case coming up. It's complicated, and I need someone who's got a good head on their shoulders. Someone with a bit of experience, but who's also not afraid to think outside the box." Bill felt a sense of hesitation bubble up. "You want me to help you with a case?" "Clint, I haven't even practiced law in years. I'm just getting back on my feet after everything that's happened." "I know," Clint responded quickly. "But you've got something most lawyers don't have: real-life experience. You've been through the fire, and I can see that it's made you stronger, more resilient. I need someone who can think on their feet and handle pressure. And after everything I've seen you go through, I think you've got what it takes." Bill was taken aback. Was Clint really asking him to step into the courtroom again? After everything that had happened, the thought of it was both thrilling and terrifying. He had once loved the thrill of the courtroom, the challenge of making the case, winning over a jury with logic and emotion. But he had also sworn to leave that life behind. Or had he? Clint must have sensed Bill's hesitation. "I'm not saying you need to come back full-time, Bill. I just need your help with this one case. Think of it as a test run. You don't have to make any decisions right away, but I think this could be a good opportunity for you to get your feet wet again." Bill's mind raced. This wasn't just a call for help, it was an invitation, an opportunity to prove to himself that he still had what it took. But could he handle it? Could he really step back into that world after everything that had happened? And more importantly, did he even want to? "I need to think about it," Bill said, his voice more uncertain than he wanted it to sound. "Take your time," Clint replied. "But don't take too long. This case isn't waiting around for anyone. And just so you know, it's a big one. The stakes are high. But I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think you were up to it." The call ended shortly after that, leaving Bill with more questions than answers. He sat there in silence for a moment, staring out the window, trying to process what had just happened. For weeks, he had been focused on rebuilding his relationship with Emily, on finding stability again. And now, out of nowhere, Clint had thrown him back into the world he had walked away from. The world that had once been his identity. It felt like fate was pulling him back into the life he had tried to escape from. Could he do it? Was he ready to face the legal world again, to dive into a case that could make or break someone's life. He thought back to the words Clint had said, "You've been through the fire." Bill couldn't deny it. He had been tested in ways he had never imagined. And maybe, just maybe, it had made him stronger. But was it enough to carry him through another trial? The decision weighed heavily on him, but in the end, he knew he had to make a choice. His life couldn't be defined by the past, he had to move forward. He had always been a fighter. Maybe this was his chance to prove that he wasn't just a man who survived the storm, he was a man who could thrive in it. Bill grabbed his phone and dialed Clint's number. "Clint, I've thought about it, and I'm in. I'll help with the case." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a chuckle. "I knew you'd come through, Bill. Welcome back to the world of high-stakes cases. Let's make it happen." Bill sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing. This was it. The next step. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt. But with Clint by his side and his determination to make things right, Bill felt ready to face whatever came his way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, but it would also bring new opportunities. And for the first time in a long while, Bill was excited to see what lay ahead. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days were a whirlwind. Bill Turner had agreed to help Clint Eastwood with a case, but it wasn't until he stepped into Clint's office that the gravity of the situation truly hit him. He had spent years out of the courtroom, trying to distance himself from the stress and strain of legal battles. Now, it seemed like fate had a way of pulling him back in. Clint's office was exactly what Bill had imagined, sleek, modern, and filled with an air of quiet authority. There were bookshelves lined with law books, old case files stacked neatly on a desk, and framed photographs of Clint in various stages of his career. Bill felt like a small fish in a very big pond as he walked through the door. Clint stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. His posture was relaxed, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that Bill had come to respect over the past few months. Clint had a way of making people feel both at ease and on edge at the same time. It was part of what made him such a formidable force in the courtroom. "Bill," Clint said as he turned, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm glad you're here." Bill nodded, trying to hide the nervousness creeping up on him. "Thanks for bringing me in. I'm still a little unsure about this whole thing, but I'm ready to get to work." Clint walked over to his desk and grabbed a manila folder. "I understand. It's not an easy decision to jump back into something as high stakes as this. But I wouldn't have called you if I didn't think you had what it takes." Bill hesitated before speaking. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Clint opened the folder, revealing a set of legal documents. "This is a criminal case. A man named Henry Caldwell has been accused of embezzling millions from his company, a high-end investment firm. It's a complex case, lots of moving parts. And frankly, we're up against some pretty heavy hitters in the legal world." Bill felt a lump form in his throat. Embezzlement cases were always tricky, especially when the amount of money involved was so large. It was a case where one wrong move could destroy a person's life. "What's the angle here, Clint? What makes you think we have a shot?" Clint leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Henry Caldwell claims he's innocent. He says he was framed, that someone inside the company is trying to take him down. But the evidence against him is overwhelming. If we're going to make this case work, we'll need to find a way to poke holes in that evidence, find a flaw in the system." Bill scanned the documents in front of him, his mind already starting to analyze the case. There was a lot of paperwork, a lot of fine print, but he was familiar with it. He had been trained for this. But the doubt still lingered. Could he do it? Could he really step back into this world and succeed? Clint must have sensed his hesitation. "Look, I know this isn't easy. But we're in this together. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm not going to let you sink. We're going to take this one step at a time. Bill nodded, feeling a bit of the tension leave his body. He wasn't alone in this. He had Clint, someone who had seen it all, done it all. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough to give him the confidence he needed. For the next few hours, Clint and Bill went over the details of the case. They discussed the evidence, the timeline of events, and the key players involved. Bill was impressed with Clint's methodical approach. Every detail was scrutinized, every possibility considered. As the meeting came to a close, Clint stood up and clapped Bill on the shoulder. "We'll start digging into this tomorrow. You up for it?" Bill hesitated for a moment, then stood up as well. "Yeah, I'm in. Let's do this." Clint smiled. "I knew you'd say that. Get some rest tonight, Bill. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As Bill left Clint's office, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't just about proving his own worth, it was about helping someone who might truly be innocent. It was about getting back into a world that had once consumed him, but now, it seemed more like a chance at redemption. That night, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing again. He had spent so many years hiding from this world, avoiding the courtroom, avoiding the pressure. But now, with Clint at his side and a case on the line, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The following day, Bill threw himself into the case. He spent hours combing through financial records, meeting with experts, and strategizing with Clint. Each piece of the puzzle seemed more complicated than the last, but Bill's mind was sharp, and with every breakthrough they made, he felt more confident. It wasn't just about winning, it was about proving to himself that he still had what it took. And as the days passed, Bill realized that he wasn't just working for the case anymore. He was working for himself, rebuilding a part of him he had almost forgotten. But just as things were starting to fall into place, a bombshell dropped. Bill and Clint were sitting in Clint's office when the door burst open. A man in a suit stood there, panting slightly as if he'd just run across the building. "Clint." "Bill," the man said urgently. "We've got a problem. Caldwell's alibi, it's been compromised." Bill's stomach dropped. It wasn't the kind of news anyone wanted to hear in the middle of a case. Clint stood up, his expression going from calm to intense in an instant. "What do you mean, compromised?" The man stepped forward, handing Clint a stack of papers. "We've just received word that Caldwell's alibi witness has gone missing. He's been in hiding for the past 24 hours. We don't know why, but it looks like someone's trying to shut him up." Bill's heart raced. Everything was beginning to unravel. They were running out of time, and the stakes had just gotten much higher. Clint turned to Bill, his face hardening. "Looks like the real fight is just beginning." Bill's palms were sweating. But there was no turning back now. He was in it, all the way. The next morning, Bill Turner woke up with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. As he sat down to a quick breakfast, he couldn't shake the image of the man who'd come running into Clint's office the day before, with news that Caldwell's alibi witness had vanished without a trace. It was a game changer, and Bill knew it. His mind was racing, piecing together the new information they had. If Caldwell's alibi was compromised, that meant the case was about to take a major turn. Everything they had been building up to, the strategy, the evidence, the hope that they might win this, was now at risk. But it wasn't just about winning anymore. This was bigger than that. This was about justice. It was about proving that an innocent man could survive this storm of deceit. Bill dressed quickly, grabbed his bag, and headed out the door. The air was crisp as he walked to his car, a knot forming in his stomach. He had no idea how they were going to fix this, but he knew one thing for sure, they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Clint was already at the office when Bill arrived. As soon as Bill stepped into the door, Clint looked up, his face serious. The atmosphere was tense. "Morning, Bill," Clint said, his voice a little lower than usual. "We've got a lot to work through today." Bill nodded. "I know. I was thinking about the missing witness. We can't afford to lose him. He's our only real shot at proving Caldwell's innocence." Clint raised an eyebrow. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been trying to get in touch with the witness, but no luck so far. Whoever's after him is keeping him hidden, and it's not going to be easy to find him. But we don't have the luxury of waiting around. We need to act fast." Bill sat down at the table, flipping through the case file that Clint had spread out in front of him. "We need to put pressure on Caldwell's company. Someone there knows something, or at least they're in a position to help us." Clint thought for a moment. "You're right. There's a guy in the legal department of Caldwell's company who might be able to point us in the right direction. His name's Robert Moore. He's been with the company for years, and if anyone knows what's going on, it's him." Bill looked up. "What's the catch?" Clint sighed. "He's not the type of guy to just hand over information. We're going to need leverage. If we can get something on him, something that he's hiding, we can use it to force him to cooperate." Bill nodded slowly. This wasn't going to be easy. They were walking a tightrope, balancing between the law and the murky waters of corporate secrets. But they had no choice. If they wanted to save Caldwell, they had to find a way to force Moore to talk. "Let's go see him," Bill said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "We don't have much time." The drive to Caldwell's company headquarters was quiet. Bill's mind was focused on what they were about to do. Getting Robert Moore to talk wouldn't be simple. It wasn't just about asking the right questions, it was about making him feel like he had no choice but to cooperate. When they arrived at the company's sleek, glass building, Clint led the way through the lobby, past the security guards who barely looked up as they walked by. Clint had a way of moving through the world with confidence that made people take notice without realizing why. They took the elevator to the top floor, where Moore's office was located. The door to the office was open when they arrived, and Moore was sitting at his desk, looking over some papers. He didn't seem surprised to see them. If anything, he looked like he was expecting them. Clint didn't waste any time. "Mr. Moore, we need to talk. It's about the Caldwell case." Moore didn't respond immediately. He simply looked up at them, his face neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation, perhaps a hint of concern. "I'm afraid I don't have much to say about that case," Moore replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not involved, and I don't know anything that could help you." Clint smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was sharp, almost predatory. "I think you know more than you're letting on, Mr. Moore. And I think we can make this very easy for you, or very difficult." Bill could see the subtle shift in Moore's posture, the way his fingers tightened around his pen. He was already on the defensive. "Look," Moore said, his voice a little firmer now. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I can't help you. I've told you everything I know." Clint stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You're lying, Mr. Moore. I know you're hiding something. And if you don't want things to get ugly, you'll tell us what you know about Caldwell's alibi." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. Moore's face was an impassive mask, but Bill could tell he was struggling with something. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about," Moore said, but there was a crack in his voice. Bill knew they were close. They just had to keep pushing. Clint leaned in, his face inches from Moore's. "If you don't tell us what you know, I'll make sure your little secret doesn't stay so secret. We can make your life very difficult, Mr. Moore. I can make sure you lose everything you've worked for." The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of truth and threat. Bill watched Moore's eyes shift, the hint of fear now unmistakable. Moore exhaled sharply, and for the first time since they'd entered the room, he looked genuinely defeated. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll tell you what I know. Clint straightened up, his demeanor shifting back to a more measured tone. Good. Now, tell us everything. The next morning felt different for Bill Turner. There was an air of urgency in everything he did. The information Robert Moore had provided had turned their investigation on its head, and now, they were closer than ever to unraveling the truth. But with each revelation came a new set of dangers. Bill couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was becoming a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were much higher than anyone had anticipated. Clint Eastwood's calm, collected demeanor didn't waver as they sat in his office reviewing the new information. Bill could tell that Clint was analyzing every word Moore had uttered, seeing the larger picture that Bill was still trying to piece together. Clint was always several steps ahead, and Bill felt like a student once again, learning from the master. I can't believe it, Bill said, rubbing his temple as he looked over the notes they had taken during their meeting with Moore. If what he's saying is true, Caldwell isn't the one we need to be worried about. It's someone inside his own company pulling the strings. Clint nodded, eyes scanning the papers. Exactly. It's always someone close to the target. They're too careful to leave obvious fingerprints. But Moore's slip-up was enough to give us a lead. Bill leaned forward, intrigued. So, we're really going after someone within the company? Someone who's trying to frame Caldwell? Clint let out a low sigh, leaning back in his chair. It's not that simple. Whoever's behind this knows how to cover their tracks. But we're getting closer, and we need to act quickly. If we give them too much time, they'll find a way to bury the truth. Bill stood up, pacing the room. His mind was racing. This case was rapidly evolving, and every new piece of information seemed to deepen the mystery. We need to find the link between Caldwell and Moore. If Moore's hiding something about the alibi, there's got to be something connecting him to whoever is orchestrating this. Clint's gaze was sharp. Exactly. We need to dig into Moore's background. See who he's been in contact with, and if there's any connection to anyone in Caldwell's inner circle. Bill nodded, turning toward the door. I'll make some calls. We can't let this slip through our fingers. Hours later, Bill found himself in a crowded cafe, sitting across from an old friend. Tom Dawson was a private investigator Bill had worked with in the past. Tom was a master at finding connections, and Bill knew that if anyone could help him track down the information they needed on Robert Moore, it was him. Tom, I need your help, Bill said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. I'm digging into a case, and we need to know everything we can about a guy named Robert Moore. His background, connections, anything that might link him to the real criminals behind this. Tom raised an eyebrow, looking at the envelope with interest. This is a big one, huh? You're not usually this serious. Bill leaned in. This is bigger than I thought. I'm not just trying to win a case anymore. This could change everything for Caldwell, and we need to get ahead of whoever's trying to take him down. Tom opened the envelope, glancing through the papers. All right, I'll get on it. You know I'm the best at this kind of thing. I'll track him down, see who he's been talking to. But be careful, Bill. If Moore's connected to the wrong people, things could get ugly. Bill nodded, feeling the weight of Tom's words. I know. But we're already in deep. We can't back out now. That night, as Bill drove back to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something huge. Every lead they followed seemed to pull them closer to the heart of the conspiracy. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The phone in his pocket buzzed. He pulled it out and saw Tom's name on the screen. Bill's pulse quickened. Bill, Tom said, his voice low and tense. I found something. Robert Moore's not as clean as he looks. There's a connection to a high-profile investor, someone with a lot of power in the financial world. And there's a trail of money that leads back to Moore. Bill's heart skipped a beat. Who's the investor? What are we dealing with here? Tom paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with realization. The investor's name is Alexander Rivers. He's got ties to several shady business ventures, and I'm betting he's the one pulling the strings behind Caldwell's back. Moore's been covering for him, and it looks like he's been getting paid to keep Caldwell in the dark. Bill's mind raced. Rivers. That name rings a bell. He's one of the wealthiest men in the country. If he's involved, this goes way beyond a simple corporate dispute. Tom's voice dropped lower. Exactly. This isn't just about embezzlement anymore. It's about power, control, and money. Rivers has been using Caldwell's company as a pawn in a much bigger game. And Moore's been the middleman, handling the dirty work. Bill gripped the steering wheel tightly. This was getting out of hand. How do we stop them? Tom's response was grim. We need proof, Bill. Something solid. But I don't know if you're ready for what you might uncover. Bill's jaw clenched. I don't have a choice. I'm already in this. We need to expose Rivers and Moore, and I don't care what it takes. As he ended the call, Bill's thoughts were clouded with uncertainty. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but he knew one thing for sure, this wasn't just about saving Caldwell anymore. This was about bringing down one of the most powerful men in the country, and that wasn't going to be easy. The next day, Clint and Bill met again, ready to take on the next step in their investigation. Clint had been in touch with some of his contacts, gathering information about Alexander Rivers and his connections to Moore. We're going to need to play this carefully, Clint said, as he scanned the information in front of him. Rivers is a dangerous man. If we go after him without solid evidence, we'll be crushed. Bill nodded, but there was no hesitation in his voice. We're not backing down. If we can prove that Moore was working for Rivers, we'll have the leverage we need to break this case wide open. Clint looked up from the papers, his expression intense. Then we move fast. We find the proof, and we make sure Rivers knows we're onto him. But we need to be ready for a fight. This is going to get ugly. Bill felt the weight of Clint's words. But he was ready. Whatever it took, they would bring justice to Caldwell, and expose the truth. The following morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Bill Turner couldn't shake the tension that had been building ever since their meeting with Tom. The web they were unraveling seemed to grow more complicated by the minute. Every new revelation about Robert Moore and Alexander Rivers raised more questions, and now Bill was certain they were on the edge of something explosive. They were dealing with powerful people who could destroy anyone who stood in their way. Clint had remained stoic, his focus unwavering, but Bill could sense the undercurrent of urgency in the air. They needed solid proof to take down Rivers, and they needed it fast. But the question was, how could they get it without putting themselves in danger? Bill sat across from Clint, who was already going through a stack of documents. He had the demeanor of someone who was always thinking 10 steps ahead, but even Clint couldn't deny the stakes were higher than ever. We're running out of time, Clint, Bill said, leaning forward in his chair. We need something that connects Rivers directly to Moore. If we're going to take this to court, we can't just rely on hearsay or circumstantial evidence. Clint looked up, his expression thoughtful. I agree. But we need more than just a link between them. We need to tie Rivers directly to the conspiracy against Caldwell. If we can do that, we'll have the leverage we need to push him into a corner. Bill felt the weight of Clint's words. They were playing a dangerous game, and every move had to be calculated. One wrong step, and they could find themselves in even deeper trouble than they were already in. But how do we get to Rivers? He's got connections everywhere, Bill asked, rubbing his temples in frustration. He's untouchable. Clint didn't hesitate. Not untouchable. But he's careful. Too careful. That's why he's been using Moore to do his dirty work. But Moore's starting to crack. If we push him, he'll fold. We just have to make him feel like he's out of options. Bill thought for a moment, then nodded. So we keep the pressure on Moore. But what about Rivers? Clint's eyes narrowed, a glint of determination in them. We don't go after Rivers directly, not yet. But we can start digging into his financial dealings, his business partners, and any illegal activity he's been involved in. Rivers is a high-profile investor with a lot of skeletons in his closet. Someone like that always leaves a trail. Bill was starting to see Clint's strategy. We use Rivers's greed against him. If we find something that links him to an illegal transaction, we can force him to cooperate. Clint leaned back in his chair. Exactly. If we have something on him, he won't be able to keep up the charade anymore. But we can't make a move until we're absolutely certain we have what we need. The next few hours were spent combing through every bit of information they had. Clint's network of contacts had come through, and they now had access to some of Rivers's financial records. But even with this new intel, Bill felt the pressure mounting. They were playing with fire, and every moment they wasted was another step closer to the point of no return. Clint's phone buzzed, and he answered it without hesitation. Bill couldn't hear the conversation, but he could tell by Clint's expression that something had changed. Clint's eyes were narrowed, his jaw clenched tight. "This is it," Clint said as he hung up the phone, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "We've got a break." Bill's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Clint slid a piece of paper across the table to Bill. It was a transaction record, and at the top was Alexander Rivers's name, alongside a number of offshore accounts that raised more than a few red flags. Bill's eyes scanned the page quickly, and he felt the weight of the discovery. This wasn't just a paper trail, it was proof of illegal dealings. Rivers has been funneling money through offshore accounts, and Moore's been helping him cover it up. "This is the smoking gun we've been looking for," Clint said, his voice low. "If we bring this to light, Rivers won't have a choice but to fold." Bill felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the realization that this was far from over. They had the evidence they needed, but now they had to figure out how to use it without tipping off Rivers or Moore. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. "We need to take this to the authorities," Bill said, but Clint held up a hand. "Not yet," Clint replied. "We need to make sure Rivers knows we're onto him. If we go to the authorities now, he'll find a way to cover his tracks. We need to make him sweat. Get him to turn on Moore." Bill nodded slowly. He knew Clint was right. They couldn't risk tipping their hand just yet. They had to make sure their next move was the right one. The days that followed were filled with tension. Bill and Clint worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, building their case against Rivers and Moore. But the pressure was starting to wear on Bill. Every phone call, every meeting, every lead they chased seemed to add another layer of complexity to the situation. And then, as if on cue, everything exploded. It was late in the afternoon when Bill got the call. He had just left Clint's office and was heading to his car when his phone buzzed. It was Tom. "Bill, you're not going to believe this," Tom said, his voice frantic. "I've been digging into Moore's personal accounts, and I found something. Something big." Bill's heart raced. "What is it?" Tom hesitated, then dropped the bombshell. "Moore's been laundering money through a series of shell companies, and one of them is directly tied to a criminal organization. I don't know all the details yet, but this goes way deeper than we thought. If you're not careful, you could be walking straight into a trap." Bill's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a corporate conspiracy anymore. This was organized crime. The stakes had just been raised, and the risk of losing everything had never been more real. Bill's thoughts were a whirlwind as he made his way back to Clint's office. What Tom had just revealed was game-changing. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stop now. When Bill arrived at Clint's office, Clint was already on the phone, his face serious. Bill didn't need to ask what the conversation was about. He could tell from Clint's expression that things had just escalated to a whole new level. Clint hung up the phone and looked at Bill. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly. "We've got people in this case who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. And now they know we're coming for them." Bill felt the weight of Clint's words settle in. The danger was real, and it was closing in. But they couldn't back down now. They were in too deep, and they had come too far. "We keep moving forward," Bill said, his voice determined. "We're not stopping until we bring these people down." Clint gave him a small smile, the first sign of encouragement Bill had seen in days. "That's the spirit. Let's finish this." Bill couldn't sleep that night. The weight of the situation hung over him like a thick fog. His mind was racing with thoughts of what Tom had uncovered and what Clint had said. It wasn't just about getting Caldwell out of trouble anymore, this had grown into something far more dangerous. A criminal syndicate was involved, and if they didn't handle it right, everything could spiral out of control. Sitting in his apartment, Bill stared at the stacks of papers scattered across the coffee table. The proof they had gathered, Rivers's financial records, Moore's involvement with the shell companies, the ties to organized crime, was enough to bring them both down. But it wasn't enough to guarantee safety. If they didn't play their next move perfectly, they'd be walking straight into a trap. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his train of thought. It was Clint. "Bill, we need to meet." Clint's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that Bill couldn't ignore. "Something's come up. It's time to act." An hour later, Bill found himself sitting in Clint's office once again, the weight of the situation pressing on him with every passing second. Clint was already in the middle of examining new documents, more records, more connections, and didn't look up as Bill sat down. "We're running out of time, Clint," Bill said, breaking the silence. "If we don't do something now, we might lose our shot at Rivers. And Moore's only going to get more desperate." Clint paused and looked up at him, his eyes sharp. "That's the point. Rivers and Moore will start to feel the heat, and when people get cornered, they make mistakes." Bill leaned forward, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the desk. "So, what's the next move?" Clint folded his hands in front of him, his face expressionless. "We're going to set a trap." Bill raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A trap? For Rivers?" Clint nodded. "Yes. We have the evidence to expose him, but we need to make sure we get to him before he can destroy it. He won't let this go down without a fight. We need to create a situation where he has no choice but to show his cards." Bill's mind raced. He wasn't sure what Clint was thinking, but the strategy was clear. They had to force Rivers's hand, make him panic and reveal his involvement in the conspiracy. But it wasn't going to be easy. "How are we going to do that?" Bill asked, already knowing Clint's answer. "We're going to use Moore as leverage," Clint said flatly. "We've already got enough on him. If we go public with it, Rivers will have no choice but to act. But we have to make it look like Moore's about to crack." Bill rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "So we stage a threat to Moore. Make him feel like he's about to be exposed." Clint nodded again, his eyes glinting with calculation. "Exactly. We create a sense of urgency. Moore will feel the pressure, and Rivers will come to his rescue. We'll have everything we need to bring them both down." Later that evening, Bill and Clint put their plan into action. They arranged a meeting with Moore, carefully setting up the right atmosphere. It had to be convincing. Moore had to believe that his only option was to make a deal with them, or face losing everything. Bill and Clint waited in a small, dimly lit conference room in a downtown office building. The walls were bare, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Clint paced back and forth, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tense energy. Bill, too, felt the nerves running through him. This wasn't just about Caldwell anymore, this was about taking down a criminal network, and one wrong move could mean disaster. When Moore finally arrived, his face was tight with anxiety. He was visibly shaken by the pressure they had applied. Clint wasted no time. "Sit down, Robert," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken threat. "We know what you've been doing." Moore's eyes darted between Clint and Bill. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice betraying his panic. Clint took a seat across from him, leaning forward slightly. "We have the evidence. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the criminal connections. We've been watching you for a long time." Moore's face drained of color. "You're bluffing. You can't prove any of it." Clint gave him a cold smile. "I don't need to prove anything yet. But you do. We're giving you one chance, Robert. Turn on Rivers, and we'll make sure you walk away with your freedom. If you don't, we'll take this to the authorities, and Rivers will make sure you disappear." Moore's eyes flickered with fear. He was caught in a corner, and he knew it. Bill could see the internal struggle happening behind Moore's eyes. He wanted to fight, but he knew Clint wasn't bluffing. The evidence was there, and Rivers wasn't the type of man to let someone like Moore live if he became a liability. "I can't," Moore whispered, shaking his head. "Rivers will kill me. You don't understand, he's untouchable." Clint's gaze hardened. "We're not asking you to take him down alone. We just need your help. You can either work with us, or we'll expose everything. It's your choice." There was a long pause. Moore's hands were trembling as he clenched them into fists, the sweat dripping from his brow. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "All right. I'll talk. But you have to promise me protection. Rivers will do anything to stop me." Clint's expression softened just slightly. "We'll make sure you're safe. But first, we need everything you know. Names, locations, accounts, everything." As Moore began to spill what he knew, the puzzle pieces started to come together. He confirmed Bill and Clint's suspicions about the criminal organization Rivers was running, and the extent to which Moore had been involved. Moore had been the middleman, but Rivers was the mastermind, orchestrating everything from the shadows. The scope of the operation was far greater than Bill had realized. But the deeper Moore went into the details, the more dangerous things became. Rivers wasn't just a businessman, he was a ruthless criminal who had left a trail of destruction in his wake. The lives that had been ruined, the people who had been silenced, it was more than Bill could comprehend. Clint remained calm, nodding along as Moore provided the details. But Bill could see the fire in Clint's eyes. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about stopping a man who had manipulated and destroyed countless lives for the sake of power and money. Bill felt a cold resolve building within him. They had the evidence, they had Moore's testimony, and now it was time to make their move. But they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The clock was ticking, and every minute that passed brought them closer to Rivers's wrath. As dawn crept across the horizon, Bill and Clint sat across from each other in Clint's office, the weight of the information they had just uncovered heavy in the air. The walls, usually a calm haven of books and legal papers, now felt like a trap, closing in around them as the danger escalated. They had all the pieces they needed. Moore had confirmed everything they suspected. Rivers was not just an investor or a businessman, he was a criminal mastermind with ties to global syndicates. The network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and illicit transactions Moore had described painted a damning picture. But they were at a crossroads. Rivers had always been 2 steps ahead, and now, with the evidence in their hands, it was time for their final move. Bill felt the pressure. If they moved too quickly, Rivers might retaliate before they could take him down. If they moved too slowly, they risked losing the element of surprise. "What's our next step, Clint?" Bill asked, his voice low with determination. "We have to act fast." Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. The first thing we do is get Moore into protective custody. We can't risk him changing his mind. He's our best chance to put Rivers away for good. Bill nodded. Protecting Moore was critical. He had already provided them with the kind of inside information they could use to ensure Rivers was exposed, but without protection, Moore would be a sitting duck. Rivers wouldn't hesitate to eliminate him if he thought he could. Once Moore's safe, Clint continued, we go public with the information we've gathered. We can't just drop it in one go. We have to hit Rivers where it hurts, target his assets, his connections, his network. We need to expose everything. This is our chance to break the chain and dismantle his operation. Bill's mind was already racing with the possibilities. But we need to be careful, Clint. Rivers won't go down without a fight. If we tip him off, he'll disappear, and we'll lose him forever. Clint's gaze sharpened. Exactly. Which is why we need to act with precision. We can't afford any missteps. But if we do this right, Rivers won't have time to react. Bill exhaled sharply. He knew Clint was right. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt businessman, it was about taking down a criminal empire that spanned the globe. And that meant putting their own lives at risk. Later that evening, Bill received a call from Tom. The urgency in Tom's voice was unmistakable. Bill, this is bad, Tom said, his tone frantic. I've been digging deeper into Rivers's operations, and I've found something that could change everything. He's been preparing for this. I don't think we have much time. Bill's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? I've been tracking his financial movements. Rivers has been quietly moving his assets, liquidating everything and preparing to flee. If you don't move soon, he's going to vanish before you can do anything about it. Clint had warned him about this. Rivers wasn't the kind of person who would sit idly by while his empire was being dismantled. He would strike back, and strike fast. Thanks for the heads up, Tom. We're moving forward tonight. You make sure you're safe. Don't take any chances, Bill said, his voice firm. The call ended abruptly, but the message was clear, time was running out. Clint and Bill convened again, finalizing their plan. There was no turning back now. Their strategy was twofold. First, they would ensure that Moore was safely relocated to a secure facility. Second, they would release a carefully timed leak of Rivers's financial records to the press, ensuring that the public and authorities were alerted to his illegal activities before he could get away. It was risky. They knew Rivers would retaliate. But with Moore in protective custody and the evidence in the public eye, Rivers would be trapped. He would have no choice but to confront them, and that was exactly what they needed. As night fell, Bill and Clint arrived at the safe house where Moore was being kept. The place was discreet, nobody would think to look for him there. Bill could see the fear in Moore's eyes, but there was also a sense of relief. The man had been living in constant fear for too long, knowing that Rivers's power could crush him at any moment. We're ready, Clint said quietly, glancing around the room. Everything's set. We release the leak in the morning, and Rivers will have no choice but to come out of the shadows. Bill nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. He had no illusions about what was coming. Rivers wasn't going to surrender quietly, and if he knew Bill was behind this, it would only make him more dangerous. The following morning, as the sun rose, Bill and Clint sat in a back room of a local press office, watching as the first headlines began to roll in. The documents they had leaked were now public knowledge, and Rivers's criminal empire was exposed for the world to see. The financial ties to organized crime, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, it was all laid bare. But it didn't take long for Bill to realize that something wasn't right. Clint, Bill's voice trailed off as he read through the live updates on his phone. Rivers isn't reacting the way I thought he would. There's no sign of panic. No immediate threats. It's almost like he's waiting for us to make the first move. Clint's expression darkened. He's too smart to act in the heat of the moment. He's setting the stage for his own counterattack. Bill's stomach churned. If Rivers was waiting for them, then they were already in his crosshairs. "Look at this," Bill said, showing Clint his phone. "It's a press conference. Rivers is making a statement. He's not hiding." Clint swore under his breath. "He's trying to control the narrative. He's turning this into a game of power, trying to shift the blame onto someone else." Bill's mind raced. They had to stay ahead of Rivers. If Rivers had figured out their strategy, they had no time to waste. "We can't let him win," Bill said, determination in his voice. "We take the fight to him." Clint stood up, his expression steely. "Get ready, Bill. This is going to be the hardest part of the whole operation." The tension in the air was thick, as if the world was holding its breath. Bill and Clint had played their cards carefully, but Rivers had just fired back with an unexpected move. He was publicly denying everything. The press conference he held earlier had sent shockwaves through the media. Rivers was no longer the shadowy figure lurking in the background. Now, he was trying to reclaim his image, manipulating the public to believe he was the victim in all of this. Clint sat at the table, his fingers drumming steadily on the surface as he watched the news broadcast. Bill sat across from him, his mind spinning. Rivers was not just fighting back, he was actively trying to turn the tables. "What do you think?" Bill asked, watching Clint closely. Clint's eyes never left the screen as Rivers continued to speak, painting himself as an innocent businessman caught up in a conspiracy. "He's playing the long game. He's not panicking, which is smart. But it also means we're not dealing with just a simple criminal. Rivers is a strategist, and he's trying to control the public narrative." Bill leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "So, what's our next move?" "He's not going to fall for anything we throw at him unless we change the rules of the game." Clint was quiet for a moment, his mind working quickly. He could feel the weight of the decision they were about to make. This was no longer just about exposing Rivers, it was about winning a battle of wits, where one mistake could cost them everything. "Tomorrow," Clint finally said, breaking the silence. "We go after his public image. We need to turn the tide in our favor. Rivers is trying to control the narrative, so we're going to give the media something they can't ignore. A bombshell that will force his hand." Bill's heart rate quickened. "What kind of bombshell?" Clint's lips curved into a grim smile. "We hit him where it hurts the most, his reputation. If we can tie him directly to something even bigger than his financial crimes, something that will destroy his public persona for good, Rivers won't be able to recover from it. He'll be cornered." Bill felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He'd seen Clint's brilliance, but this was different. This was a high-stakes gamble, one that could either bring Rivers to his knees or make them both targets. "Are we ready for that kind of exposure?" Bill asked, his voice tense. Clint's gaze was unwavering. "We don't have a choice. Rivers has been too careful for too long, but everyone has a weak point. We're going to find it." The following day, Bill and Clint set their plan into motion. They began by contacting the right people, the ones who could help them spread the truth about Rivers. They knew the media could be manipulated, but they also knew that if they played this right, they could use it to their advantage. What Rivers hadn't accounted for was the fact that the press was hungry for a story, especially one as big as this. With Moore's testimony secured, and with the financial documents already exposed, Bill and Clint now needed one final piece to make their case unassailable. They dug deeper into Rivers's past, and there it was, something darker than they had ever expected. It wasn't just financial crimes anymore. Rivers had ties to organized crime on a global scale, and those ties went back further than anyone could have imagined. But the real bombshell came when Clint received an anonymous tip from an insider who had been working for Rivers for years. The insider claimed that Rivers had been involved in several high-profile murders that had been staged to look like accidents. The deaths of witnesses, rivals, and anyone who could expose Rivers's criminal activities were now tied to him with undeniable evidence. This was the thing that would tear his empire apart. As the story broke, the media went wild. The revelation was shocking. Rivers wasn't just a corrupt businessman or a manipulator of finances, he was a murderer, responsible for countless lives lost to cover his tracks. The public, who had once seen him as a respectable businessman, was now demanding answers. Bill and Clint watched the reports roll in, knowing that Rivers would not take this lying down. He was no longer just trying to protect his assets, he was fighting for his freedom, and he would stop at nothing to escape this. Clint's phone rang, cutting through the tension in the room. He answered without hesitation. "It's Tom," Clint said, his voice tight with focus. "He's got something." Bill leaned in, his attention now fully on Clint. "What is it?" Clint listened for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Rivers is making his move. He's trying to get out of the country, he's preparing to leave the country tonight." Bill's heart skipped a beat. They were running out of time. "Where is he going?" Bill demanded. "He's got a private jet waiting." "We don't know exactly where, but it's definitely happening tonight," Clint responded, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to stop him before he disappears for good." It was time for the final act. Bill and Clint quickly made their preparations, coordinating with the authorities to ensure Rivers couldn't escape. With the media in full frenzy, the police were ready to move. They had already tracked Rivers's private jet, and the authorities were waiting for the go-ahead to intercept him before he could take off. But Clint wasn't just relying on the police. He had one last card to play, a final confrontation with Rivers himself. Clint knew this would be the most dangerous part of the entire operation, but it was the only way to ensure Rivers couldn't wiggle his way out of this. Bill and Clint arrived at the small private airport where Rivers's jet was stationed. The place was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of engines and the bustle of ground crew. Clint didn't waste any time. "Stay close," Clint ordered as they made their way toward the hangar. "This is it. We can't let him get away." As they approached the plane, a shadowy figure appeared at the entrance of the hangar. Rivers was there, his eyes darting nervously between Clint and Bill. He knew the jig was up. "Clint, Bill," Rivers sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You think you've won? You don't even know what you're dealing with. You're both too small to make a real difference." Clint didn't flinch. He had expected Rivers's bravado. "It's over, Rivers. You're done. The world knows what you've done, and you won't be able to escape this time." Rivers's smile faltered, and for the first time, Bill saw fear in his eyes. The empire he had built was crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. "You can't stop me," Rivers spat, his voice shaky now. "You have no idea what I've done. You think this is the end?" Clint stepped closer, his tone cold. "It's over. Surrender now, or we'll make sure you never see the light of day again." For a long moment, Rivers stood there, locked in a silent battle with Clint's unyielding stare. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned and walked toward the plane, but Clint wasn't about to let him go. "I said, it's over." Clint's voice rang out as he reached for his phone, signaling the authorities to make their move. The authorities stormed in seconds later, surrounding the plane. Rivers's escape plan had been thwarted. As Rivers was handcuffed and led away, Bill couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and disbelief. The man who had terrorized so many lives was finally going to face justice. The courtroom buzzed with the hum of reporters and onlookers as the final trial of Rivers' empire began. For Bill and Clint, it was a long-awaited moment, but one that felt strangely anticlimactic. The years of danger, uncertainty, and the personal toll of everything they had sacrificed had led them to this single point. Rivers, the man who had nearly destroyed so many lives, now sat behind bars awaiting the sentence that could change everything. Across the aisle, Clint stood with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on Rivers. The man was no longer the sharp, calculating figure who could manipulate situations in his favor. His once imposing presence had faded, replaced with the defeated, haggard look of a criminal trapped by his own actions. The fight was over, but Clint knew there was a price to pay. Clint had always believed that justice would prevail, that the system would catch up with the most dangerous criminals, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just scratched the surface. The truth was that Rivers had run his criminal network for years, and he wasn't the only one. There were other figures, other corrupt forces in the shadows that Bill and Clint hadn't even begun to uncover. As the judge entered the courtroom, the murmurs quieted, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor stood to address the court, laying out the final charges against Rivers: conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and even murder. But it was the charge of organized crime that seemed to resonate most with the people in the courtroom. The realization that Rivers had masterminded a global operation that reached far beyond the borders of the country was too staggering for many to fully comprehend. Rivers sat silently, his face impassive, betraying nothing of what was going on in his mind. But Clint knew better. Rivers was calculating his next move. Even now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, he was likely already trying to find a way out. The prosecutor's voice broke through Clint's thoughts, calling attention to the fact that Rivers had failed to show any remorse for his actions. His lack of empathy was one of the reasons the case had been so difficult to build. Even when the weight of the evidence was piled against him, Rivers refused to accept any responsibility for the pain he had caused. "Your Honor," Clint's voice rang clear through the courtroom. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, but I can't help but feel that justice isn't always about winning. It's about the impact we leave behind. Rivers didn't just steal money from people, he took their lives. He took their hope. But, I've learned something throughout this case. There's always a way out, always a chance for redemption. The question is, how much are we willing to fight for it? How much do we believe in the possibility that one person can make a difference?" Bill, hearing Clint's words, felt a surge of emotion. He had seen Clint in action, calculating, precise, and always in control. But today, in this moment, Clint was speaking from the heart. Clint wasn't just fighting for justice for the victims. He was fighting for the world to change. He wanted a system that would stop people like Rivers from getting away with their crimes, a system that would make sure that they didn't have to deal with the consequences of their actions alone. After Clint finished speaking, the judge took a long moment to deliberate before finally speaking. "The court has heard all that needs to be heard. We will now proceed with sentencing." As the judge spoke the words Bill and Clint had been waiting for, the room went still. Rivers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a victory, but it didn't come without cost. The sense of relief that Bill and Clint felt was tempered by the knowledge that there was still so much work to do. Rivers was just one cog in a much larger machine of corruption that still loomed in the background. The courtroom began to empty out, and Bill stood, his mind spinning. There was no real celebration, no party, no grand victory. Just a quiet sense of accomplishment mixed with a deep, haunting realization that while they had brought down a powerful figure, the fight was far from over. As Clint made his way toward Bill, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it. We got him. But we both know this isn't the end." Bill looked up at Clint, a sense of camaraderie settling over him. "Yeah. The real work starts now. The people Rivers worked with, those who helped him build this empire, they're still out there." Clint nodded. "They'll keep coming. But so will we. The fight never ends. But now, we have the power. We've proven that justice is possible." The next few days were a blur. News outlets across the world covered the trial's outcome, with Rivers' sentencing marking the beginning of the unraveling of his empire. But even as the world cheered the victory, Bill and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just started to peel back the layers of corruption that ran deep. They knew they couldn't rest. There were too many people out there, still fighting to take down those who operated in the shadows. Clint was ready for the next challenge. Bill, though more weary than ever, was beginning to understand that this was more than just a career for Clint. This was a cause, one that would never allow him to stop fighting. As Bill prepared to leave the courthouse, Clint stopped him, a sly smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You know, Bill, it's not just about the fight. It's about the people you fight for. They make all of it worth it." Bill paused, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had been there for him through everything. Clint was more than just a mentor now. He was family. And together, they were ready to take on whatever came next. Bill stood in the quiet office, staring at the city skyline through the large windows. The sun had set, casting a warm glow over the streets below, but it felt as though the weight of the day was pressing down on him. He had always imagined the moment Rivers was taken down to be something monumental, something that would make everything feel worth it. But here he was, standing alone, feeling more conflicted than ever before. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts, and Clint entered the room with his usual composed demeanor. There was something about Clint that had always intrigued Bill, his unwavering confidence, his ability to stay calm no matter the pressure. But today, there was something different in Clint's eyes. "You okay?" Clint asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern that Bill wasn't used to hearing from him. Bill took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "I don't know. It's strange. We did it. We got Rivers. But, it doesn't feel like enough. I thought things would change after this, but all I see are more problems. The system's broken, Clint. It's bigger than just one man." Clint stepped forward, leaning against the desk with a knowing look in his eyes. "I get it. It feels like the battle is never really over, doesn't it? But what we've done here, Bill, it's a spark. It's proof that the system can work, that justice can be served, and that people who abuse their power can be held accountable." Bill turned toward Clint, his gaze steady but filled with uncertainty. "But how many more Rivers are out there? How much longer until we're back at square one?" Clint gave a slight shrug, his expression softening. "There will always be more. There will always be people who try to cheat the system, who think they can get away with anything. But that's where we come in. It's up to people like us to keep pushing forward. To keep fighting." Bill nodded slowly, taking in Clint's words. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a job for Clint, it was a purpose. It wasn't about the fame, the accolades, or the personal victories. It was about something greater, the chance to make a real difference in a world that often felt broken and corrupt. "I've been thinking," Bill said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe this was more than just about Rivers. Maybe it's about making sure the next Rivers doesn't happen. Maybe we need to change the way things work, not just put out fires." Clint's eyes sparkled with interest. "You're getting it, Bill. That's the real fight, the long game. Changing things from the inside. Not just patching things up, but creating a system that can actually work for the people, for everyone." Bill's heart pounded in his chest, a sense of clarity finally breaking through the fog. He had been so caught up in the immediate battles that he hadn't allowed himself to see the bigger picture. But now, he understood. It was no longer enough to just win cases, it was time to reshape the system, to be part of something that could truly make a lasting impact. "I'm in," Bill said, his voice firm with resolve. "Whatever it takes. We do this together." Clint's smile was subtle but genuine. "I knew you'd say that." The days that followed were filled with new plans and new possibilities. Clint and Bill worked together, reaching out to people who shared their vision, a vision of justice that extended beyond individual victories. They began laying the groundwork for a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting corruption, bringing transparency to legal processes, and ensuring that the most vulnerable would always have a voice. Bill found himself more driven than ever. It wasn't just about taking down criminals or solving individual cases. It was about fighting for systemic change. And with Clint by his side, Bill knew that together they could accomplish anything. The two of them traveled the country, meeting with experts, activists, and community leaders. They spoke with people who had suffered under corrupt systems, who had lost everything to powerful figures who thought they were untouchable. Clint had always believed that one person could make a difference, but now, with Bill's help, they were building something that could make an entire community stronger. With every step, Bill felt more alive. This was what he was meant to do. This was his purpose. As the months passed, Rivers' empire crumbled in the wake of his conviction. More arrests followed, and the ripple effect of Clint and Bill's work reached far and wide. The non-profit organization they had founded began to gain traction, garnering support from people who had been waiting for something like this to take shape. And with each passing day, the weight of the world on Bill's shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't just fighting against one person anymore, he was fighting for an entire system. One night, after a long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Bill and Clint sat in a quiet bar, their drinks in front of them, the clink of ice the only sound between them. The world outside was bustling, but in that moment, it was just the two of them, reflecting on how far they had come. "You know," Bill said, breaking the silence, "I always thought the good guys won in the end. I always thought there would be this clear-cut moment where everything would just fall into place. But now, I see that it's more complicated than that. It's a never-ending fight. And sometimes, you win battles, but you never truly win the war. You just keep fighting." Clint leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's the truth, Bill. The fight never ends. But what matters is that you keep going. Even when it feels like nothing's changing, even when you're not sure if you're making a difference, the key is persistence. And you're doing it. We're doing it." Bill took a sip of his drink, contemplating Clint's words. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He had spent so many years doubting whether the fight was worth it. But now, he knew. The real victory wasn't in the big moments, it was in the quiet moments, the ones where you realized that you had stayed true to your values and had made a real difference, no matter how small the steps. As they finished their drinks and prepared to leave, Bill realized something: the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The future was uncertain, but with Clint by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?